afternoon. Today is May 3rd, 2017. I am Paul Glumaz, and I'm an activist in the LaRouche movement, and this is being brought to you by the General Welfare Presents. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to talk about something most people have not heard of. And it's very important at this time in history. It's something that Lyndon LaRouche refers to as placement. Now, there's many different aspects of placement. The first aspect is the placement of the voice of the person in the mind in such a way that it speaks the truth. Then there's the placement in the imagination of the participant in the chorus, where in the imagination, the voice is being instructed to modulate with the other voices to render a conception that the composer of a composition has created. This is not the notes. This is the idea of the composition in the mind of the performers, who are having to work together in a community, a kind of a dialogue, a musical dialogue. But it's not a dialogue. It's being able to sense where the other members of the chorus are and how you have to complete it. Now, this concept of placement is very, very important in the nature of a true dialogue between individuals. The concept of placement is you put yourself in this position in the imagination of being truthful. And there is this dialogue going on around a concept that's being developed. And that concept is not completed by the individuals, but is completed in the process of the dialogue. And when you have a conversation in which the conversant, those in the conversation have placement, they are not trying to one-upmanship, or they're not trying to show off. They're not trying to belittle each other. They're not trying to go stream of consciousness, based on, you say one word and then you have a whole story on that one word, and then another word, and then you have rather they're trying as a group to come to an idea that's being developed, to fulfill the concept that is not spoken, it's not said, but it's there. And those of you who've had those kind of conversations know that there's a certain intensity, there's a certain focus, and there's a certain collaboration in reaching the concept that the other person is trying to. Even if you disagree with the other person, you want them to be able to express the concept as best as possible. So you are helping them develop the concept. Okay? And even though you may disagree with that concept, and then you're hoping that the other person will help you develop your concept, and then you can compare both concepts. That form of placing oneself in the imagination of truthfulness, in the imagination of a sincerity of wanting to understand not only what the other person is saying, but to understand what you're trying to get at, which otherwise is very hard to articulate. So you have other people in the conversation with you to articulate a concept. Now, that concept, to some degree, has to be a concept that is necessary, or has to be, in some degree, a concept that is at least important to the individual involved, the development of that concept. So that's in a conversation. Now, in that kind of conversation, it's the only kind of conversation you can actually have truthfulness. You may not arrive at the truth, but you have a sense of truthfulness. And it's also the only kind of conversation where you have actual a human quality to it. And it mirrors the quality of a classical course, and it mirrors the quality of a real conversation. And okay, so the next level on this is that this kind of conversation is the essence of government. In other words, if you don't have people involved in that kind of conversation over the nation, over what is best for the nation, over what is the good, what is the general welfare, what is the commonwealth, what is the necessity for the nation, or what is the best thing to do for the community or the nation, what have you. If you don't have that quality of conversation where people from different points of view and different orientations are working to try to figure it out, and they're trying to develop their ideas on this, if you don't have that kind of a dialogue, if you don't have that kind of concept, you really don't have a government. You really don't have a functioning government, right? It's not functioning. Okay, and if you don't have some of that going on in the Congress, if at least behind the scenes, you don't have a functioning Congress. And most of all, if you don't have that process going on centered around the presidency, you don't have a functional presidency. And this becomes very important now in the case of Donald Trump, who is currently president. And he's definitely not committed to the policies of his predecessors. But how does he shape the policies of the future? He cannot just issue dictates and say, well, we want to do this, we want to do that. It doesn't work that way. There has to be a conversation. And that conversation has to increasingly include larger areas of the society. That conversation has to include Democrats. It has to include conservatives. It has to include business people. It has to include labor people. It has to include all kinds of different people. That's on the domestic level. And on an international policy level, that conversation needs to include major world leaders. Okay, where are we taking the nation? Where are we taking the planet? What is the relationship of my nation to the future of the planet? Okay, this is very important because Trump is not going to be able to make a positive policy unless that kind of discussion is going on internally in the United States and also externally with other leaders. Okay, and that is the basis of government. It's not that is the basis of government, is this placement of oneself in the future of where things must go. And on what basis do we know that those things are necessary or not necessary? Okay, this is very, very important. Now, Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche have spent most of their life from the standpoint of what is it that is necessary, both in terms of the relationships between nations as well as the domestic policy of the United States, but also what is necessary for the human race in terms of creating a future. And that future cannot be the same static society, but it has to be a developing society with increasing productive power per capita, with increasing development of science and technology, and with an increasing level of culture of the individual, and also an increasing population. That view is of where things must go is different from allowing the invisible hand of a monetary system to rule or to determine where things must go. It is different than the situation where we have lived since the end of World War II, where we have lived in fear of the Soviet Union. We're now living in fear of Russia and China. We're living in fear of terrorism. We're living in fear of everything, of immigrants. But you can't have that placement of the individual in that imaginary place where you're actually considering policy. If you're fearful, if you're completely motivated by base instincts, if you're just motivated by greed, or ambition or career, you are not placed, because you're not placing yourself in that position of a conceptual responsibility for the chorus, or for the dialogue, or for the nation, or for the policies, or for whatever. you're not really functioning in a place in that sense. And the issue of placement is very important. For if you are placed properly, you have courage. Why do you have courage? Because you know that no matter what happens, things have to go this way. Why do things have to go this way? Because if they don't go that way, society is going to be destroyed. There's going to be a disintegration of society. Well, who are you to even think that you have that quality of knowledge or that quality? But no, you have a quality of placing yourself in that position in the imagination, similar as in the chorus or in a conversation, where you're seeking the truth, you're seeking what is the good, you're seeking what is necessary. Okay, now, how many times have the individuals watching this tried to develop a concept and somebody says, "Shh, get to the point," or they say, "Wait," or they say, or they completely shut you down because they don't want to participate in that. They don't want themselves to be placed in a placement where they can have that dialogue with you. We live in a society where people are more afraid of the put down and being put down because they're genuine and they're trying to develop a concept or an idea. It's very hard to do. And if you watch the media, if you watch how they treat people in interviews, if you watch the talk shows, it's very controlled. And you try to develop an idea that's outside of the box of what they're creating, whether it's left or right, conservative or liberal or whatever, then you get shut down. You get shut down. They don't want that. It's not that they don't want you to say what you're going to say. That's secondary. It's they don't want to have a placement where that kind of placement in the discussion takes you in a place which is not controlled, which is not predetermined. And so you're dealing with this fundamental issue of placement. And but you can't have real truthful dialogue without that being done. Now there's another aspect of placement, which is the issue of history. Where do you place yourself in history? Well, that means you have to have a context of history. Our youth are not getting a very good sense of history, of world history or U.S. history, or even a wrong sense of history, even a false sense of history. They're not even getting that. Because if you have a false sense of history, you can, at least you have a framework to re-examine the falseness of your sense of history, that you realize, I see, that didn't really was this way. No, they don't getting any sense of history. So there's no context in which to put themselves in the imagination as part of history. Right? Put themselves in the imagination as part of history. But if you are a political person and you want to do good, you have to put yourself in history. Where are we now? What has gone wrong that has brought us to this point? What do we have to do to change it? And where do we have to go? And who do we have to go with? What nations do we have to work with? How many people out there are thinking like that? The average person, is the average person thinking like that? Is the average person putting themselves in that historical imagination, in that historical place of representing history? History is not something made by just blind forces. The British historians will try to tell you that the history is made by millions of individual decisions that culminate in some pattern or some thing like that. No, history is made by people who put themselves in a position of looking to the future, both in terms of the negative aspect of reducing the world's population down to 1 or 2 billion and imposing certain conditions, but also of people who have another different kind of placement. History is made by those people. If those people are making history because there's an intention. There's an intention to create the direction. The British monarchy and the European aristocracy and their allies and the forces that they deploy and the financial system, they have an intention. They have a long-term intention of bringing the world's population down to 1 or 2 billion people, reducing it to almost a pre-industrial level, quasi-industrial level. And that is their intention. And they are placing their activity and they're placing themselves in a position of how to carry it out. That is the long-term perspective. And there are not necessarily that many people in the oligarchy or in the monarchy or in the who are actually doing that. But they're the ones who have the intention. And right now, their intention is in deep question because Obama is no longer there. Obama was an extension of their intention. And Trump is not an extension of their intention. And everything isn't working out with Trump. He's developing a relationship with China's leader, Xi Jinping. He's about to develop a relationship with Putin. And if Putin and Xi Jinping have discussions with Trump, which have this quality of placement, where they're actually talking about what is the best thing to do for the United States, for Russia, for China, that's a different place. That's a different kind of placement, right? And so you have Donald Trump coming out, shocking the media, shocking the establishment by saying that under certain circumstances he would be honored to meet with Kim Jong-un, the young dictator of North Korea. You know, no president's ever said that before. It's shocking. And the media is going after him, calling him a friend of dictators. But that's not the point. The point is that this came about as a result of his dialogue with Xi Jinping. So he's actually working with Xi Jinping. That's part of what's happening, is that he's working with Xi Jinping. And whether they will resolve that situation, get North Korea to agree to abandon its nuclear program and stop its missile tests in exchange for the necessary support and economic development that they require, remains to be seen. I can guarantee you that every effort is going to be made by the British and their friends in the United States, the Clinton crowd, the Obama crowd, to wreck it, the neocons, to wreck that. But if you have an intention of the good and you have an intention of what the better future would be, you want to not have to live under the terror of North Korea being fearful, that being put in a box and being fearful and so forth, where you will give ultimatums to North Korea, which only makes it worse. And that's what it's intended to do, because it's the manipulation of the North Korean situation which allows for the disruption of the One Belt, One Road, of the development of the northeastern part of Eurasia. So if Trump is well-meaning, and he's in a discussion, he's in a dialogue with Xi Jinping, and potentially he had a call yesterday with Putin. He has that dialogue with Putin. He does not appear to be coming in with a preset orientation that we're going to have continuous conflict. We're going to destroy Russia. We're going to destroy China. We're going to impose this global environmental dictatorship over the world, and we're going to reduce the world's population to 1 or 2 billion. He's not coming from that perspective. Does that mean that he won't make mistakes? Oh, he probably will make a lot of mistakes. But it's very important that the leadership of Russia and China give him slack. It's very important that they try to engage him in a dialogue as well, in a discussion where the placement is over the question of what is best for the human race, what is best for your nation. So it's in that context that you can look at figures like Lincoln, FDR, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You can look at figures in history. They were placed. They had a sense of placement. They were not pessimistic. They had true optimism. Why do they have true optimism? when everything around them was garbage. Well, they had true optimism because they had a placement. They had a sense of where things had to go. No matter how bad it looked for them going in that direction, it didn't matter because they had a sense of placement. That's where it has to go. And you don't compromise with that. LaRouche never compromised on where things had to go. And when he was in prison, and his wife Helga was very much involved in Europe, they put together the plan after communism collapsed to develop all of Eurasia. And that plan took a number of different forms, and in the early 1990s, it ended up being as the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road. And now that is the plan. It was understood that the future of humanity depended upon building the bridges, economic bridges, to unify all of Eurasia and develop all of Eurasia. And that from that development, you would have not only peace, but you would also have a future, but you would also have a dramatic improvement of the life of all of the people of Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Europe. That was understood. That was what was presented. And it was only in 2013, 4 years ago, that the president of China decided to go with that policy, with that program. And now it's taking off. And the entire world is starting to orient to that. But that's what I mean by placement. Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp LaRouche had placement. What must the world go for it to have a future? In 1974, the LaRouche movement founded the Fusion Energy Foundation. At that time, we knew that ultimately the world would have to develop fusion power to be able to have the means to travel in space and have the abundant energy beyond fossil fuels that would allow for human civilization to flourish and prosper. And in 1987, the federal government shut down the Fusion Energy Foundation, which had a magazine called Fusion, which had a circulation in the hundreds of thousands, and it was a very polemical magazine. It shut it down. Our government shut it down because under the Bush administration, under the Reagan administration, which had been taken over by the Bush crowd, the latter part, they shut this thing down. So that's what I mean by placement. It was understood that that's where we had to go, and it was understood that we had to organize support for that. And the fusion energy program his funding got cut dramatically. There was a bill that was put into Congress in '79, but it passed, but it got shut. The whole thing got shut down. It was never really went with the level of funding and commitment that would be required, because you're talking about a huge program. I mean, you're talking about something that will transform humanity on the most profound level. But that's what I mean by placement. Placing yourself in the future, saying, where must humanity go? Where's the best possible direction that humanity must go in? Now, if human beings can do this, the question is, what about the universe? Does the universe have a direction like that? What about the biosphere? Does the biosphere have a direction like that? We see increasingly complex systems, ecosystems, and new species coming in. And we see more energy efficient species like mammals versus reptiles versus amphibians, and more developed species of fish replacing earlier, more lesser developed species of fish. Is the universe also based on a sense of somewhere to go? And can the human if so, can the human species, can human individuals who are leaders harmonize themselves to that concept of where the universe must go? But the British Empire is completely based on disrupting the ability of our citizenry to have any kind of sense of placement. They place them in fear, they place them in terror, they place them in greed, they place them in lust, they place them into rage, anger, stoking their rage and anger or whatever. Everything is based on that. It's not based on, and the media backs that up, and it's not based on where we must go. And we got to start having the discussion within our citizenry about where the nation must go, and then and then we go into all of the policies and programs.